In 1942, Albert Einstein was teaching at Oxford University. And one day he just gave an exam of physics to his senior class of physics students, and he was walking on the campus with his assistant, and all of a sudden the assistant looked at Albert Einstein and said, Dr. Einstein, this exam which you just gave to the senior class of physics students, isn't that exactly the same exam you gave to exactly the same class 1 year ago? Yeah, said Albert Einstein, it's exactly the same. But Dr. Einstein, how could you possibly do that? The assistant said. Well, said Einstein, the answers have changed. The answers have changed. In other words, what is true for 1942 is even more true for today. We live in a world where the questions might be the same, but the answers have changed. In other words, what has got you here will no longer get you there. And if you want to have results that you've never had before, well, you need to start doing things you've never done before.
Dr. Ioannidis, when we spoke to you on March 23rd, you said we needed more data before we could ascertain what was happening. Since then, you've been busily gathering that data and have published 3 studies. Let's start with the latest one, which you entitled COVID-19 Antibody Seroprevalence in Santa Clara County, California. What was the purpose of that study and what did you discover?
This study aimed to generate an estimate of how many people in Santa Clara County have been infected with the virus. And the way to find out is to try to see whether they have developed antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. So we had a sample of residents in Santa Clara County evaluated for the presence of antibodies. And the sample was 3,300 people who came to be tested. We estimated that based on what we saw, between 2.5 and 4.2% of the population of the county has antibodies, which is an indication that they have been infected with the virus a while ago.
Is there a way that each of us can do impossible things to truly create dramatic results? And the good news is that the answer to that question is yes. Because what I'm going to explain today is, when it comes to high performance, why the majority is always wrong and how you can use that to get everything you can out of everything you've got. But let me first introduce you to something interesting, an interesting observation. When people, teams and organizations, whenever they hit a wall, they tend to do one of 2 things. They either do more of the same things or they do less of the same things. But what you very seldom see is that they start to do different things instead. And it's interesting, if you look at the data, approximately 3% of people are inclined to even do different things. And the remaining 97% continues to smash into the wall like some kind of crazy energy bunny on steroids. And why is that?
Give us a sense, what can we know, or at least project, about where we are in the progress of this disease, given what we saw in Wuhan province?
Yeah, so the data that are coming in from China, from Korea, are really interesting. There's been a lot of panic and a lot of focus on very, very high mortality numbers. But the thing to remember about those numbers is that they're measuring people that show up at the hospital or already have severe conditions. Just like almost any cold or flu, there's a range of reactions. Some people get very, very mild sickness, and some people have a much more severe illness. We're not measuring the people with a mild illness, and so the mortality numbers people suspect are likely to be lower than being reported. So for instance, in Korea, South Korea, where they've measured a much larger population of people, the mortality rate looks like a very, very bad case of the flu, as opposed to mortality rates in the 2s or 3s, which would be much, much worse, 20 times worse than the flu.
Why is that? And to understand what is going on here, we need to ask ourselves another question. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of thinking? What is the purpose of thinking? Now, if you ask that question to a brain scientist, the brain scientist will say, well, the purpose of thinking is to stop thinking. The purpose of thinking is to stop thinking. Now, what does she mean by that? Well, here's the thing. Thinking is a high energy activity. It takes a lot of energy to think. So whenever we think, we try to think as short as possible, and then we return to automatic pilot. Over 95% of our life we run on automatic pilot.
Actually, this is a theme I want to bring up. It's really uncertain right now. There's many variables still yet to be cleared up. We don't know really the death rate. We don't know fully the recovery rate. And I think this is partly why you're seeing essentially a worldwide panic in response to this. It's not just how severe the condition is, which I think is probably less severe than we're seeing, but the uncertainty around that. And that's I think leading to a lot of the economic effects that we're seeing with the virus.
In other words, ladies and gentlemen, we tend to think inside the box, and the box is a very good metaphor here. So let me draw a box. And if you take a close look at the box, you see that the boundaries of this box are very well defined. So we think inside defined boundaries. I'll give you an example. One boundary is a legal boundary, and we think within the legal framework. I'll give you an example. Very few of you would think of stealing the wallet of the person next to you in order to fund your next cool startup. Yeah? At least that's what I hope. So we think in legal boundaries, but there are other boundaries as well. We think in technological boundaries, we think in physical boundaries, but we also think in moral boundaries. And this is why we think inside the box. At least that's what we think.
A new study out of Germany using antibody testing shows that the coronavirus may not be as fatal as once previously thought. The study focused on one of the hardest hit regions in Germany called Heinsberg. It found that 15% of the population had antibodies for the virus in this area, suggesting they'd had the disease already, with a mortality rate of 0.37%. That's less than 1/5 of the mortality rate considered in Germany as a whole. Joining us now, the scientist behind this research, Professor Heinrich Streeck. He's a director of the Institute of Virology and the Institute for HIV Research at the University of Bonn. Professor, good afternoon to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon.
I guess so. The starting point clearly is a very concentrated area of infection in Germany where you've done a lot of testing, and the encouraging result of that is a much lower death rate than previously thought.
Yes, so what we did was a representative study within this area where we had a high prevalence of cases already. So it got hit pretty hard by COVID-19. But the surprising part, what we found was that there were 15% in that population that didn't know that they had an infection. And overall, that we are calculating a case fatality rate, so how many people are actually dying of that disease in that population, is 0.37%. So this case fatality rate is not actually different probably in other countries, but that we can assume a pretty high rate of infections that are asymptomatic.
So those are standards, those are norms in the industry or professional field. But this is what you need to know. The word norm is an abbreviation for normal. In other words, if you do what everyone else is doing, you get results that everyone else is getting, and those are normal results. And the thing is, what we are after today are extraordinary results. So the key question is, of course, how can you kick yourself out the box? Out of this very small box of your industry and professional field, and move to the happy place where cool innovation happens. Yeah, how can you do that?
If you compare the numbers that we estimate to have been infected, which vary from 48,000 to 81,000, versus the number of documented cases that would correspond to the same time horizon around April 1st, when we had 956 cases documented in Santa Clara County, we realized that the number of infected people is somewhere between 50 and 85 times more compared to what we thought, compared to what had been documented. Immediately, that means that the infection fatality rate, the chance of dying, the probability of dying if you are infected diminishes by 50 to 85 fold, because the denominator in the calculation becomes 50 to 85 fold bigger. Our data suggests that COVID-19 has an infection fatality rate that is in the same ballpark as seasonal influenza. It suggests that even though this is a very serious problem, we should not fear. It suggests that we have solid ground to have optimism about the possibility of eventually reopening our society and gaining back our lives.
Sooner rather than later, I hope.
Sooner rather than later, with full control and a data-driven approach.
So, ladies and gentlemen, what it tells us, there is a method to the madness. And by understanding that the majority is always wrong when it comes to high performance, finally you have the opportunity to quit fixing things and move to massive innovation instead. Ladies and gentlemen, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius once said that the object of life is not to side with the majority, but the object of life is to escape finding oneself joining the ranks of the clinically insane. If you do what everyone else is doing, you're not distinguishing yourself and you're probably stuck. And this is why, when it comes to high performance, the majority is always wrong. This is what we know. We know that 3% of people are able to achieve extraordinary results. And each of you can become part of those 3% by deciding as of today to break your industry standards and to break your industry norms. The alternative, of course, is that you become part of the 97% who in the end works for those 3%. And as of today, that choice is completely yours. Thank you very much.